React syntax, small little tricks, and pretty much learn the entire documentation, which is right over here. So that, like a dictionary, we understand every single thing about React, every single tool in the library. But here's the thing. You can do that on your own. You don't need me to tell you what the documentation says. And as a developer, you should learn how to read the documentation. However, I do understand that sometimes it's nice to have somebody show you how things work, how maybe something that isn't clear online is explained. So we're going to take a different strategy than most courses here. And I've talked about this before. What we're going to do is we're going to try and simulate a real work environment. What does that mean? Well, moving forward, we're going to start off building our e-commerce website. We're going to build a full-out online clothing shop. From start all the way to finish where we put it online. It's going to allow us to do a ton of things. But what we want to mimic here is how in a real life scenario, you would most likely be working with somebody, perhaps a senior developer. So along the way, I'm going to ask you to code along, have your code side by side next to the videos as we work through the project together. And as we build the project, we're going to encounter different problems, different things that perhaps we haven't learned yet in React. And slowly, we're going to learn these things as we build the project. Because we could spend the next 20 hours just building 5 more useless projects that aren't impressive because they're things that you can do in a day. What impresses employers and what gives you actual work experience is building these large projects from start to finish. So we're going to choose this path. So if you feel like, hey, I feel like I only know maybe 40% of React, then that's okay because we have a long way to go. I hope that you stick around because by the end of this course, that 40% of knowledge is going to grow. And we're going to try and build something from scratch so that at the end of the day, you don't just learn a list of tools, but you learn how to lead projects, how to explain to people how React works, how to decide on good architecture. It's time to get started.
Categories of items. And from these items, we're actually going to be able to add them to our cart. And from our cart, we're actually going to see these things directly update. And from this cart, we're going to be able to check out, increase or decrease these items again, and see the live changes in both our checkout page and our cart page, remove items, and actually integrate with a Stripe API so that we can handle payments. Now, this is actually going to be a test version of Stripe because we don't actually have items to ship and we don't actually want to process real payments because this is just a portfolio project. But the matter of switching it is simply a change in the actual Stripe website. You're going to actually learn what it is to actually build using the Stripe API. And beyond that, we're also going to integrate with Firebase to handle our authentication and our storage. So with Firebase, we're actually going to be able to authorize our users using Google so that we can sign in with our Google accounts. And once we sign in, we're also going to provide a sign out feature and a sign up and sign in with email and password feature. So it's going to be a really fleshed out, fully complete e-commerce platform, just like you would build for a real e-commerce company. Before we begin, I'd just like to point out something that will help you get the most out of this course. Personally, I think the best way to learn is to code along as we build our e-commerce platform. But I know there are some learners that just like to watch and listen and then maybe look at the code themselves later. That's perfectly fine. I've set up this course so that both these type of learners can get the most out of it. If you go to my GitHub and navigate to my GitHub account, so you go github.com/zhangmyihua. If you check the repositories, you will see a bunch of them that say lesson 1, lesson 2, lesson 3, all the way up to 27. Now, in each of these repositories is going to actually be the code that we finish writing at the end of every lesson related to building our e-commerce platform. So if you get lost, you can always just follow the link that I will provide in that lesson to one of these repos and get the code from there. I'm going to show you very quickly how that would work. So let's say we finish lesson 1 and we start talking about lesson 2 and you want the code, or let's say lesson 3, and you want the code related to lesson 3. You would go to the repo and you would hit this button, clone or download. From here, we go into our terminal, and I'm going to teach you a little bit of Git here. So we go git clone, and then we put down the link that we just copied, and then we can put our own name of our folder for where we want this to be stored, or we can just let Git do it, and it'll just name it whatever the name of the repo would. So it would be lesson 3. So let's just call it cloned repo. So Git will clone that project into this folder now called cloned repo. And inside will be all of the code related to what we just pulled down. Now, if you wanted to continue from this package and you want to save your progress in your own repository, what you have to do is actually change the remote. So if we type in git remote, we'll see that there's actually an origin already here, right? And this is pretty much just the name of another repo that this is attached to. And that repo is my repo, the one that you just pulled this code from. But because you cannot push to my repo, because I don't want that code changing, because I want all the students to be able to benefit from the code that is already there, what you're going to do is you're going to remove this remote. So you're going to type git remote, remove, and then origin, right? And now you won't have an origin in your remote. So you're going to add your own. And first what you have to do is create a new repository, and you can call yours whatever you want. Let's say you call it cloned repo, just for an example. When you create this repo, you can take this SSH key here, and then you can do git remote add origin, and then you would just put in your SSH key that you just copied. You'd hit enter, and now you can push to your repo anything on this code, and you can also pull. So what this remote is essentially it's just a pointer to some repository that is not on your local device, right? And you want to call it origin because if you use any shorthands like gg push or gg pull, in case you're using something like Z shell, which adds that for you, what it will do is it is essentially an alias for git push origin master or git pull origin master. So naming an origin is just easier for us. And now if you push, you'll be able to push all the code that you just pulled in from my repo into your own repo. So if we refresh, we should see our code, and there it all is. Now, always remember to also run yarn or npm install so that you download all of the packages related to your project. And now that you know what to do, let's get started with building our final application. Okay, so I know those last few sections were really theoretical, but I'm glad you stuck in there because now comes the exciting part. We're going to build our e-commerce platform. So first, let's use Create React App to build out our project for us. So I'm going to call it Crown Clothing, actually. Now, this is going to take a little time, so we just have to wait for Create React App to finish setting up our project. Awesome. So what we're going to do is we're going to cd into our new project, and let's open it up. Now, just like last time, it's given us a couple files that we don't actually need. So we don't need any of this serverless worker code inside of index.js. So let's just get rid of it. We also don't need any of this stuff inside of our app.js file, including this class name. And instead, I'm just going to write hello world. And we also don't need this logo. Now in app CSS, we don't need any of this CSS, so let's get rid of it. And there we go. Okay, now our project is pretty much set up for us to start working with. So what we're going to do is we're going to evaluate what it is that we need to build. So when we look at this, this is the home page. And on the home page, there is a header component, which we can build after. But looking at just the content of the page, there are these 5 menu item components, right? And these 3 look similar, and these 2 look similar. But if we look closely, we'll actually realize that all 5 of them are the same component. The only difference is that these ones are bigger than these ones. So we definitely have to build this menu item component. And there's also a component that's holding these 5 elements together. So there is like a directory menu component we got to build as well. But when we look at this component, we'll see that there is an outside container of some kind and an inside container that holds a title and a subtitle, right? So it's a div with a div, and then there are 2 text HTML elements inside. So let's build that first. Now, what I'm going to do is I am going to make a new file called homepage.component.jsx. We're going to import React from React, and we're going to make it a const homepage, which is going to be a functional component because we don't really need any lifecycle methods at this point, nor do we need to store any state. So let's add in our first outside container, which will be our homepage. And then inside will be those 2 components that we were talking about. The container for the menu, and then the actual menu items. So we will move them into their own files after, but let's just put it down so we can see it first. And this I'm going to call directory menu. And then the inside div I'm going to call my menu item. Inside of our menu item, we know that there's this content container, right? So let's just make another div and give it the class name content. And then inside of our content, we want an h1 that is our title. And here we just want to put the text hats. And then we also want a span right after. That will be our subtitle with the text shop now. Now, let us copy this 5 times. Just for now, we'll end up making the components later. And we are going to put jackets. And then this will be women's, and this will be men's. Now, if we save this, we have to also remember to export our new function outside, right? So let's just export as the default, because we're probably not going to export anything else from our homepage component file. Let's import in homepage from homepage. I think it's capital. Yes, it is. Okay. Now, instead of hello world, let us render our homepage component. Okay, so we have to remember to run our project. And let's see now. Okay, there we go. So this is just our directory without any of the styling. So for the styling of this project, we're actually going to use something called Sass. And Sass is just a upgraded version of CSS. So it is a different language and it has a different file type called Sass, but it reads very similar to CSS, but it has a lot of quality of life improvements. And I'm going to show you what it looks like. So in order for us to include it, we first have to add Node Sass to our project. Now, the great thing about Create React App is that it actually comes with the configuration for Sass right out the gate. As long as we include this package, Create React App will actually configure Webpack and Babel to convert our Sass files into CSS files, because the browser can only read CSS files, right? So this is actually really convenient. And now that that's included, we have to remember to restart our server again. Okay, now this might happen. You might see this bug. All this is saying is that our version of Babel Jest that got installed which is probably a dependency of our Node Sass, is now different from what our yarn file is expecting. So what our initial package was expecting is different now. So we just got to follow these instructions, right? And we'll just follow the yarn instructions because we're using yarn. So let's first delete the yarn lock. So let's delete yarn lock, yarn.lock, and then let's delete the node modules folder. Now here it says to remove Babel Jest from our package JSON, but we actually won't have that seen because it's something that Create React App hides from us, because those are all dependencies that it's managing. So we won't do step 3, and instead we are going to run yarn to install all of our new packages all over again. And hopefully this time all of the versions will match appropriately. So there's a lot of waiting. There's definitely always so much waiting. Come on, you're almost there. Awesome. Okay, so now if we run yarn start again. Okay, so now that our project is loaded, let's just include in that Sass file. So I will show you what our Sass code is going to look like. So we're going to make another file called homepage.styles.sass now. And we're going to paste our Sass in. Now, it actually looks very similar to CSS if you've noticed, right? This is pretty much just a class selector that has some styles in it, and then another class selector with some styles in it. But inside of this one, we'll see that there are other things inside other than just our typical classes, right? Our typical styling. So here, whenever you see this ampersand symbol, this ampersand pretty much means this class that is above it, and then it wants to append this additional selector, right? This first child. So it's saying menu item first child gets this style. So anywhere where a menu item is the first child is going to get this style. Same with this one. It's the equivalent of writing .menu item and then first child in our regular CSS, right? But Sass just lets us nest it so that it's easier to read. And then you'll see this content class name with its own styling as well, right? If you hover over this, you'll see that what it's saying is that any class of content that sits between any element with the class of menu item will get these styles in it. So rather than writing normally, what we would do would be menu item and then .content like this, right? Instead, what we're going to do is we are going to just write it nested inside. And title is going to be the exact same. So any element with the class title, inside any element with the class content, inside any element with the class menu item, right, is going to get these styles. And that's what's great about Sass, is that it just lets us not have to write a bunch of CSS selectors that look unconnected to each other, right? We can just nest them all inside of the block of their relevant parent-child relationship. And you'll notice that we did the same thing in our HTML for our homepage, right? We have this menu item that has a content right? Child, and then inside of that content is the title and subtitle. Just like our Sass here. Our menu item has a content child, which has a title and a subtitle inside of it. Now we just have to make sure to import our new Sass file into this file. And if we save, if we go now to our project, we'll see that it looks very much closer without the images, right, to this now. Now, in the next lesson, we are going to start moving these components into their own folders, as well as exploring what our final folder structure is going to look like. Now, our project is actually not on GitHub yet, so let's do that. Let's go back to our browser. Let's go to GitHub, and let's create a new repository. I'm going to name my repository Crown Clothing after our project. And then we're going to create it and copy this SSH key that they give us. Then we got to go back to our terminal, into our project, and write git remote add origin, and then paste in that code. And now we've linked our project to that remote that we just created on GitHub. And now if we check the status with git status, we'll see these are the modified files, and these are the new files that we added. So we want to add them all with git add-a to our commit. And then we're going to write git commit-m for message. And we're going to say in our commit message something that is explicit about what this commit contains. So I'm going to say created project with create React app and added files for homepage. Now, I'm going to git push all our commit to origin master. And now if we check and we refresh, we'll see all our code up. Awesome. Now that we have our repository set up, let's move on.
Hey, it's Andre here. Before we move on, I want to make sure that we understand some of the files and also what we did in the previous video with some conflicts that we had, especially installing Node Sass. What really happened there? First off, when we start a project, we always have a Node modules folder. That comes built in with Create React App. Now, this Node modules folder is quite massive. As you can see, we have a ton of packages. These are all the libraries that Create React App uses underneath the hood. Remember the React scripts? If we go all the way down to package.json, you see that we have all these dependencies, but all of them are using the scripts start.js, like so. Now, Ihua uses Yarn versus what I use, which is npm. And you see over here that we have different versions. Instead of our yarn log file, for example, I have the package log file. So what you use is up to you. The key thing to remember is that Node modules contains not only all the libraries that we're going to install throughout the course, but also libraries that Create React App uses underneath the hood, like the Jest package, which allows us to do some testing. Now, the thing is, all these packages seems like a lot. And what Create React App tries to do is to create an IDE-like environment. That is, it allows us to do testing, linting, and all these things. And most of these packages are only used during development. When we actually ship our code and we build our code, most of these packages won't make it through. Only the code that is absolutely needed for the app and not for development are going to be included in this build. So some people complain that this Node modules folder is way too big, but at the end of the day, it's big because Create React App tries to make our environment for developing apps pleasant. Now, the issue that we saw with Node Sass happened because of this package Jest. But let's talk about that a little bit more, because as you develop apps, as you work with React, you're going to encounter these issues of dependency. And dependency management between libraries is a big problem to solve. Now, React, since version 2.0, comes with SaaS support, which we saw. All we had to do was install Node SaaS using npm or yarn, and we're able to use SaaS files. So that Create React App takes our SaaS files, converts them into CSS into that build folder. But what happened when we installed this? The error that you saw with Ihua is something that you'll encounter as you work with React. So I'm going to show you how to better understand the issue. See, the first thing I would do if I encounter a problem like that is I would Google for it. For example, Node SaaS error with Create React App, Babel just conflict, which was what the error we got. And if I go to the second link here, which says React scripts Babel jest version conflict, which sounds like the conflict that we're having. And right over here, as we expected, it's an open issue with Create React App where React scripts Babel jest version is conflict. And as a developer, you want to start getting good at finding these issues and going to GitHub repositories and see if anybody else has had this issue with you. And it looks like this person had pretty much the same issue that we saw. So the beauty is that you can actually read through this and understand why the issue is happening, how you can fix it, and what other people have done. If you actually scroll all the way down, you can see that this issue should be solved when this is released. So we click over here and we see that, the Create React App just merged on May 7th, which isn't that far off from when I'm recording this video, a fix for this so that this issue doesn't happen. So most likely by the time you're watching this video, you won't encounter this. But I want you to start thinking in terms of if you encounter an issue, most likely somebody else has had it. So Google it around, and usually in a project like Create React App, you'll find open issues. You have 303 issues open right now and 85 pull requests. So you want to start getting good at that. Now, another thing I want to talk about is this package lock file. If you're using Yarn, it'll be a Yarn lock file. This is used because our project most likely won't run on our computer. Most likely, once we're done with the project, we're gonna send it off to a server somewhere so that project runs on a different computer. When a user opens the app on a browser, it runs on their computer. So our code, although when we code along, is in our own environment, on our own laptop, in real life, when people actually use your app, they won't be using it from your computer, right? So package lock files allow us to have consistent installs across machines so that all these dependencies have the exact version number that they need in order for everything to work. It's like everything is intertwined. This file is what we use, or at least what Create React App uses, so it knows exactly what dependencies and what thing works with what. Just like we have Babel jest that was needed for both Node SaaS as well as for the Create React App, because both of them use it to test their code. Now, in a couple of videos, we'll actually see how Ihua solves this problem another way using something called the resolution property. And this is something that's only specific to Yarn. So if you have NPM, that isn't available for you. But again, that's just something that you most likely won't encounter, but we wanted to show you anyway. Remember, you can always read more about these things at the website's documentation. You want to start getting really, really good at debugging your own code. Finally, the last file I want to talk about is this file that we just removed, which was Service Worker. Now, this comes pre-built with Create React App, and it's mainly used for what we call progressive web apps. And we're going to talk about that later on in the course. Service Worker file allows us to make our app what we call progressive. Again, for now, we don't need to worry about this, but I do want to let you know that we are going to come back to it and talk about what Service Worker is doing, because it has some really neat features. All right, that's it for now. Off to the next video. Hey, it's Andre here. I want to talk quickly about architecting our components in our final project. If you remember, one of the key things that we want to do is to decide on components. So as we move through the course, I want you to always have a mental image of what we're building and how things are connected. Because how things are connected and how we pass down information from component to component, because at the end of the day, it's all a tree-like structure of the virtual DOM. That's really, really important. So make sure you don't get lost as we move through different components back and forth. Now, here's my tip for you to better understand how things are connected. What you want to do, and I have a version of the website here that we're actually going to build. So there's some things here that you probably won't have yet. But what you want to do is to open up your developer tools and use the React developer tools. Now, in here, this is a good way to see how components are connected. For example, if I scroll all the way up, and keep in mind that you'll see components here that we haven't talked about yet. But the key thing is that we have our app component. We have our header. So if we scroll up, we see that we're going to build a header component. If we keep scrolling down, we see we have our homepage. And then if we keep scrolling down, we have our directory, which is the items that we have on our homepage. And then within the directories, we have what we call the menu items. And the menu item component, as you can see, is these individual components that we can link to. And each time we can see what props we receive from higher above, like directory, for example, and so on and so forth. So you want to use the React developer tools to understand how things are connected if within your code you start getting confused. Keep in mind, the reason that we organize our folders the way they are is so that it's easy for us to look at our app and understand how things are working. For example, right now we know that we have pages. And at the moment, we only have one page, which is the home page. But eventually, we'll build the shop page as well. If we go back and look at our components, we have some components here that we haven't built yet. But we have the directory, which is our homepage, and then the menu items that we saw. We're also going to start building our collection preview and collection items. And those ones are going to be what we call these things. These, again, if I inspect them and open up React, you'll see that this is a collection item. So these are our collections and these are the items. If I scroll up, I see that this entire thing is surrounded in the collection component. So again, I can go back to the folder and understand that, okay, this is the collection item and the collection preview is probably what we're building to display the collection items. That groups the collection items. So start looking at the folder structures and understand how things are connected. Because eventually, by the end of this course, we're going to have a lot of things. If we look at the components folder, yep, we have a lot of components. And it's easy to get lost in all this component connections. But again, that's why React Developer Tool exists. And it's also what makes a great developer. You need to make sure that as we move along, that these component structures make sense to you. And you notice the small things that Ihua does to keep things very simple and small in each component and keeping each one specific to its concern. Doing one thing really, really well. Let's move on.
Okay. Now let's start moving our components into their own folders. So the first thing I'm going to show you is actually our new folder structure. So we're actually going to have two folders. One for components, which is going to hold all of our reusable components, and one for our page components. So what's a page? Well, when you think about our homepage, it's also a component, but it's a component that we're probably not going to use more than once. So any page that we make, I'm going to make a new component folder for it inside of our pages to separate it from our reusable components. So let's begin with our homepage component. And we're going to do component.jsx. And we're going to move our code here into our homepage. And then we're also going to copy our styles. And we're just going to move this into our homepage as well. Now, we don't need this anymore. And we have to update our app.js to point to the new location of our homepage component. So let's do pages, homepage component. Now, if we save, and if we make sure to save this as well, if we go back to our app, we should see everything is the same. Okay. Now let's start moving our directory and our menu item into their own components. So let's first start with our menu item component. So let's make a menu item folder in our components folder, and then make a menu item.component.jsx. Now we're also going to need those menu item styles. So let's make a menu item.styles.sass file as well. Let's copy over our menu item styles into our menu item styles.css. And then in our JS, let's import React from React. And for our menu item, we're going to use a functional component because we don't really need our component to hold any state, at least not for now. So let's start with a functional component. So let's do menu item equals a function that returns to us what we had in our homepage component. So let's just copy this over. Now, we probably want to be able to dynamically generate a title by passing a title into our menu component, right, as a props. So instead of doing something like props.title like this, we might also need some other properties to be passed in. If we look at our application, we're going to see that each one of these has a different image, right? So what we can do is we can actually destructure the title off of our props for now. And then we can just populate our component with that destructured value of title from our props. This is the exact same thing as writing props.title, except we're pulling that title value off of our props and then setting it to this title value inside of our function so we can use it whenever we want. And then let's export out our menu item. And now we have our menu items. Now, let's make our directory component. So let's make a directory folder, and inside we will make our directory.component.jsx. And just like earlier, we'll also need a style sheet for this, directory.styles.sass. So let's copy over our homepage styles for our directory. Now, because we got the menu item, we don't need this anymore. So let's just get rid of it. But let's copy over our directory menu code into our directory sass. And then let's import React from React. And this one will need to be a class component because we do need to store the state value of those menu items that we want to pass and create our menu items with, right? So just like when we did our monsters Rolodex and we had that card list component, this one is going to have a directory with a state value of those menu items. So let's make a class of directory that extends react.component. And remember earlier, the first time we were actually importing it as a regular import from React, but this component class actually also exists on the React namespace that we import from React. So we don't even need to do an additional import. We can just do react.component. So inside of our directory class, we need that constructor, right? We always need our constructor. And inside of our constructor, we need to call super so that we pull in all the things we need from our React component into our class. And then we're going to set our state value, right? Now, because we're populating menu items, each of these menu items is kind of like a section, right? So I'm actually just going to call it sections. And that's going to be an array value that I have here for you in a different file. And what it is it's just an array of objects that have a title and an image URL. And the image URL is going to point to an image that's stored somewhere else online for these images. So inside of our render, we want to return what we had in our homepage. So let's go back to our homepage and let's copy this directory menu because that's all we really need. And now we want to map through our sections, right? And we want to pass these section objects into our menu item so that it can create the menu items. But let's also import our menu item component from our menu item component folder. And now we know that we have to pass in a function to our map call, right? So in our map call of our array, we're going to get a section. And what we want to render is the menu item. So there are many ways we can pass the props in, right? We know that we want a title, right? So if we wanted to pass the title, we could easily just do section.title. But what we want to do is, because we know we need this value, this title value, we know we need the image URL, and we want the ID for our key as well, right? What we can do, instead of doing this, which we have to type section every time, we can actually destructure all these values off of our section. So we're going to get the title, we're going to get the image URL, and we're going to get the ID. And now we can just do this. And now we have our ID and our title going in to our menu item. So let's make sure to export our directory. Okay, and then we got to make sure also to bring our style sheet in. So I think I didn't do that for our menu item either. So let's do that as well for our menu item. And then we got to go into our homepage and replace our old code with our new components. So let's go and import in our directory from our components folder, our directory, and then the directory component. And now we can replace all of this with just our directory. And if we go back, we should see that everything is the same. Awesome. Okay. Now, what about our images? Well, you remember in our directory, we had that image URL. So let's just pass that also into our menu item. So we're going to pass this image URL value into our menu item, and then in our menu item component, we are going to actually do something different. So React actually gives every one of these HTML markup elements another property called style. And style takes an object that has prop values equal to CSS values you want to apply to this element. So what we want to do is we want to set a background image, right? And these CSS values, instead of being the kebab case that we're used to seeing here, right, with the dashes, is going to be in camel case. And we want to set it equal to the image URL that we just passed into this component from our directory. What we got to do in order to make this work in CSS is we have to actually pass it as URL with the string interpolated value of image URL. And this is really awesome because this allows us to dynamically make styles on our components which is super convenient because if this image URL change, right, our CSS value changes as well. And that's really cool. So we just have to update another style in our actual style sheet regarding what this background image URL is going to be, right? So we always want our image URLs to have that background image be centered and covering the whole div. So let's go into our menu item and let's do background position, right? We want it to always be centered. And then we want the background size to be cover. So we want our background image to cover the whole thing, and then the position should always be in the center. And now if we look, we see that our component has our images. But if we look at this, this is a little bigger as well, right, than these ones. So we know that these two need to be a larger size. So how do we do this? Well, typically in normal CSS, we could just add a class that would tell this component that it's larger, so it should have styles related to that. Well, we can do that as well with React. So inside of our directory, what we can do is we can actually pass in a size value, which is equal to large, right? And then we do that for our last two, for our men's and our women's sections. And then we can just pass that size value also into our component. And now on our menu item component, we can also dynamically add in our class name value right here, right? Because we're getting this size value, if it's nothing, it's not going to render anything. But if it is present, then we want to add it to our class name. So let's just string interpolate in that value with this, with size, right? And then we also always want it to have what we had earlier, which was menu item. And now, if we look at our menu item code, we also got to add in that style for it by doing ampersand sign. So if our menu item also has dot large, then we want to give it a larger height of 380 pixels. And now if we save and we go back, we see that our images, these ones are large, but these ones stay the same, right? They haven't changed. So that's one of the great things we can do with building out our components, is that we can use these properties and we can write JavaScript to give them a dynamically changing value so that it lends us a lot more flexibility when we're building and styling our components. Okay. Now, in the next section, we're going to style this menu item a little bit more with some of those transitions and some of these colors that we see in our final product. Now, let's finish styling our menu item component. So what we need to add to make this component look like this component is a white background for our content, a hover effect that increases the size of the background image, as well as a transition in the opacity of that content box whenever we hover over it. So how do we do that? Well, first let's go to our menu item component and let's go to our styles. In our content, we are going to add a background color of white and an opacity of 0.7. And now, when we look at our app, we see that we have that background. As for the font, let's go to Google Fonts, and let's look for Open Sans Condensed. We're going to add that to our selection, and then we'll copy this link that Google provides us. Then let's go into our index.html and add it right here underneath our other links that were provided for us. Now inside of our app.css, let's add a rule where our font family in our body, so everything inside of our body tags, we want to use open sans condense. Okay, now if we look, our application, our content box is styled the way that it was before. So how do we capitalize the title? Well, because we're writing JavaScript, we can actually use any JavaScript method that exists on strings. So because we know our title is a string, we can call to uppercase, and this will uppercase our text. And as far as our hover transition goes, this is going to be a bit of CSS that I will explain, but I don't want to go too in-depth about it, but I'll definitely cover enough that everything should make sense. So what we're going to do is we are actually going to add a new component first to our menu item component. So our background image, we want it whenever we hover over our menu item to increase, right? So we're going to add this class name of background image onto this div, and this div is going to get that style instead of our containing div. Now, the reason for this is because we actually don't want this image when it scales to be bigger, right? We just want to see the effect get bigger within our div when we hover over it. So the issue here is that some of you might think, why don't we just wrap this div around our content? Well, the problem is if we increase the size of this div, we don't want this to also increase. We want the size of our content to stay exactly the same. So if we do this and we go into our styles, we're going to add that background image selector, and we're going to give it a width of 100%, a height of 100%, so that that image is always the size of our container, right? No matter what our menu item container size becomes, whether it's large or whether it's regular, we want it to always have and share the same dimensions. So then we want to move those background properties off of our div and onto our background image. And now if we look, we'll see that it looks like our content is actually inside as a sibling. But we don't want this. We want our content to always be in the center of our actual menu item. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a we're going to add a position absolute. And position absolute is saying that no matter what happens, no matter what other elements are on the page, the position of this content will always be whatever the position calculation will be. So it's kind of like if we were to add like a right value of 100 pixels, which would mean that it's coming in from the right side by 100 pixels. We're saying that those are the only things that go into the calculation of the position of our content, right? Nothing else. So now if we look, we'll see that our content is always in the center. And now our background image has no children because this removes this from the flow of the elements of our menu item. So now the background image is the only item that's getting calculated in its flow, so it doesn't consider this anymore, and now it's taking up the whole size of our menu item. Now, we need that hover effect, and that hover effect is actually going to go on the menu item. So I actually have that code written for you right here. And let's paste it in and take a look at what it does. So we're saying that using this hover selector, right, for menu item, when you hover over it, I want the cursor to go to a pointer. Instead of an arrow, we want the finger. And then inside of that, we're saying that any element with the class background image, we want to give it a transform property of scaling it by 1. So whenever we hover, we want to scale any background image inside of it by 1.1. So essentially 1.1 times the size of the current image, right? And then our transition property is saying that we want to target the transform. So whenever it scales, we want it to take 6 seconds. And then we want to use a cubic Bezier value of this. So cubic Bezier is a pretty complicated math calculation, which determines the speed in which this transformation occurs. Now, it's going to be a lot to kind of explain this, and it's quite a big detour, but I'm going to give you a link that will show you how you can understand what cubic Bezier does, but it just enables us to have a smoother transition as far as our transform goes. And then we're also saying we want to change our content opacity to 0.9 whenever we hover over it. Now, if we look, we see that our image is growing, right? But it seems to be growing outside of the size of our menu item. So this is an overflow, and we don't want that, right? But we're getting that effect. So what we're going to do on our menu item is we're going to do overflow hidden. And now if we look, we'll see that we have our transition effect. And just like that, our menu item now looks like our final product. Now, before we continue, let's just commit all our changes. Let's go back to our terminal and let's just add everything that we've done. So we have broken our home page into smaller components, and then we also finished styling our menu item component. Okay, and now let's push to master. Awesome. Okay, now that we've finished styling our menu item and our home page, we're going to tackle routing and how we're going to render different pages in the next lesson. Hello everyone and welcome back. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can update the packages that your project depends on to the latest versions. I'm going to show you with our final Monsters Rolodex project where I will update React and React DOM to their latest versions, as well as any dev dependencies that they have. And the steps are very easy, and you can reproduce them whenever you need to update your libraries in your projects. So to start, I'm going to clone down the final completed version of our Monsters Rolodex project. You can do this with an existing project if you don't want to clone one down, and let's say you have a local one that you just want to update. The steps are going to remain the same, but I want to show you with a fresh cloned project as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy down the SSH link, and I'm going to switch into my terminal and then clone down the project. So once you have the project down, let's just cd into it. I do want to mention a couple things. Depending on the project that you clone down, you may already have a lock file. In this particular case, if we look at ls, we see we already have a yarn lock file. In this particular example, I want to show everyone how to do it with npm. So if there exists a yarn lock file already, we can just remove this lock file. In this particular case, this works because we are planning on updating all of our packages anyways. These lock files tell our package what versions are currently locked to the project. But if we're seeking to update all of these versions anyways, it does not matter. In this particular case, I also want to use npm. And if we come up with a package.lock file, which is the npm version of the lock file, then these two things might cause conflict. So this is one thing you always want to think about when you clone down a new project. So here I have our project. We have no dependencies installed yet, and our yarn lock file just got removed. In this particular case, what we want to do is we want to run npm update -d. So here what we're saying is I want to update all of the existing dependencies if you are using a project that already exists. In my case, because it is a newly cloned project, there are no existing dependencies yet. Update will still install any projects or dependencies that don't exist. So -d here is also going to give me all of the dev dependencies. So when I run this, it could take a little bit of time. So let's just fast forward through this. So here we have finished installing or updating all our respective packages. You may notice that down here, you'll see that there were 5 vulnerabilities, or however many vulnerabilities when you run it. This just means that there might be some versions that are insecure of the packages that you installed, or there might be other issues. The great thing about our package manager, whether it be NPM or Yarn, is that they can fix this. So here, NPM actually tells us exactly what to do. We just run npm audit fix. Sometimes when you run this command, though, you may get some type of error involving your package lock. So here we got that error. It says that something was found to be wrong with our package lock.json. We want to run npm install so we can fix them. So once again, very easily, we can just npm install. And we're going to go through that whole thing again. So let's just fast forward through this part as well. And here we'll see that we have once again finished our install. Any of those particular issues that came when we tried to run npm audit fix the first time were going to be resolved. But you'll notice that we still have our 5 vulnerabilities. So here, once again, if we run npm audit fix, this should now work and get rid of those problems. This process of auditing might also be quite extensive because there's so many different packages that we have installed through any of our major packages like React and React DOM. But what we're doing here is we're essentially trying to fix any of these issues. So walking through the steps that we just went through, the first thing we did is we said, let's upgrade all of our package versions. Once they're upgraded, there might be some dependency issues and vulnerabilities which were highlighted to us. So what we're doing now is we're saying, okay, take all of those vulnerabilities, NPM, and I want you to fix them to the best that you can. Maybe change semantic versions to versions that still work with our given updated versions of our packages that we want, but make sure that you give us versions of it that don't have these problems. And NPM will know how to do all of this for us, which is the great thing about using these package managers. So it's going through these steps, and now we're done. We'll see that all 5 of the 5 different vulnerabilities were fixed. And if we run npm audit, we'll see that there are no vulnerabilities. So now that we've updated all of our packages and we have the latest versions, what we can do now is just run npm start. So let's just start our project and make sure that everything is working as it should be. And we can see that our monsters Rolodex is completely working here. And if you want to double check to make sure you have the right versions, all we need to do is just open up our project. So here I'm going to make a new tab and have our server running on the other tab and just open up this project. And what we want to do is go to the log file. Inside of the log file, remember, this log file tells us what versions of our packages we're currently tied to. So if you go find the React or the React DOM library in this particular case, you'll see here that we have the latest version, which is exactly what we want. So this means that all of our projects and all of our packages are now updated to their correct version. And this is all we need to do. One last thing that I do want to mention is that due to a recent change, perhaps the master branch of your project is now called the main branch. In our particular case, you'll see that mine is still called the master branch. So this is just something that might have not been updated yet with my project, but GitHub is rolling out this change. So one last thing that we might want to do now that we've made all of these updates is just to push up the latest version that we've updated to our remote repository on GitHub. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say git add -a git commit -m updated our packages to latest version, removed and fixed any vulnerabilities. And then I'm just going to git push. And now if we go back to our project and we refresh, we'll see that we updated some of our different problems a couple seconds ago. So here, this is all we need to do to update all of our packages. I've also linked in your resources folder for this video our final project when it comes to the Crown Clothing project. I have the front end link for you so you can clone it down and practice what you've just learned with me here. You can do it with Yarn or you can do it with NPM. Just practice it and update the latest version of React and React DOM or any of the other dependencies that we have in that project if you want to try it out. You can also do it with your local version as well. You don't necessarily have to do it with a freshly cloned project, but I've included the link for you just in case you want to practice. But that's it. That's all you need to know when it comes to updating packages.